Welcome once again, White Owl Reports, Michael Edward. Today, nice Sunday morning, we're doing part 10 of a series that we've been doing about IllinoisCaves.com, the lost tomb of Alexander the Great. And today we're going to speak with Paul Schaffranke, who, if you've listened to the last episode, part 9, it was the first time that Paul was on with us. Paul is the one who broke the code, so to speak, of these different tablets and the writings that were on them, and was able to realize how to make something out of what was really an ancient Etruscan language that was written on there, among others. Paul doesn't like to be called a linguist. He's not just a linguist, because that would be an academic think only within a box, which is true. But Paul just used a lot of common sense and has a great knowledge of ancient languages, especially with Latin, which, as we discussed on the last show, was not really a spoken language. It was a government language. It was an official language for records. So Paul is, again, somebody who broke the code and is able to make sense with a lot of these writings, these tablets that came out of the Illinois caves. And I might add in there that his partner and associate from the beginning with all this, Harry Hubbard, has been able to get some fantastic pictures of additional artifacts that came out of the caves that they have never seen or dealt with before. So we're about ready to break open some new things here. So obviously this series is going to continue. As soon as we get those pictures and such, it'll be on their site, IllinoisCaves.com. Be lots of new additions on there, and I'm sure that Paul will be busy with new decipherments. So Paul, thanks again for joining me on here. I apologize last week. I had some problems and we couldn't do the show, but here we are. So good morning, Paul.
Good morning. How are you?
Great, great.
You would have no idea. The amount of information that has just come in to me the past 3 days and photographs of new artifacts is just unbelievable.
I don't doubt it. I got a preview. I got a small preview. Somebody who was with Harry took a few pictures. They weren't really good quality. But wow. Yeah, it just looks like the continuation of all the pictures on your site with new things on there. So what grabbed you? You've gotten a sneak peek probably more than I have. What did you see on there that really grabbed your attention of these new pictures of artifacts that came out of there?
Everyday life of these people.
Huh?
Even just their religious beliefs and just the things they did, and it'd be very interesting. Some of these tablets are like large with a lot of script on there, and I'm going to be very curious what I'm going to be able to come up with on the script.
Sounds like you're going to be
a lot of them are
busy.
portraits. A lot of them are scripted. Some are pornographic, which is expected from that era. Unbelievable stuff. It is just absolutely unbelievable what some of the things, just the depictions and all that. It's just artwork by common lay people at that time.
You sound like a kid who just found out it was Christmas morning.
This is exactly how I feel. Is like, wow, there's a lot more. It's just more pieces of the puzzle we're going to be able to put together. And hopefully, I mean, we pretty much have a story of a very general background story of what happened and how people got over here. But now we're going to be seeing what happened while they were over here, and just everyday life things, just things that they inscribed on rock that they wanted somebody to remember.
Wow. So now you're going to get more details.
Now we're going to get more details.
Great. Well, like I said, either like a kid that realizes it's Christmas morning, or you got in a candy store and you haven't had candy for 10 years.
It is. And another thing I noticed just by looking at a lot of these artifacts, is these were just common people that just inscribed things in their basic language. They're pretty good artists, some of them, but they really wanted to leave something to show, so if somebody picked it up, they knew what they were doing in a daily life. They wanted to be remembered.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one thing about the ancient cultures. When you look at ancient Egypt, for example, let's not just think of the pharaohs and the kings and their fancy tombs. You look at tombs of just regular middle-class people that were property owners. You know, they always had tombs built for themselves. You go to the Etruscan tombs, you go to Greek tombs, the Etruscan tombs, the Greek tombs, the Egyptian tombs, all these had beautiful artwork inside. And it was generally from day-to-day living. So, for example, in Egypt, there was a tomb they found of a farmer. He owned quite a bit of property, and on his tomb walls, he had painted everyday conversations he had with his workers, the gossip, and just simple things like that. This is what they wanted to take to the afterlife, and this is what they wanted people to remember him by. And you see the same thing in Etruscan tombs. If their favorite was literature and Greeks, you would show them hunting, going out horseback riding, or just looking over their vineyards. They would depict things that they enjoyed during life. And the same thing you see in the tombs of the Macedonian kings in northern Greece. You go inside and you see this beautiful mural of hunting. Alexander's stepbrother hunting boar and lions. This is just a depiction of horseback riding, hunting. So whatever they believed in the afterlife, which we know they did, they wanted to take the memories of their life. They enjoyed life so much that they wanted to depict it either on stone or in murals, or they believed that their soul went on to the afterlife. They wanted to take these memories from this life to the next world. Unlike a lot of people today, they want to die because they don't want to have anything to do with this live world. There's a lot of pessimism today. People just, I don't want to remember anything. I just want to die and go on to heaven, to a better place. Well, the ancient people, they wanted to take the better place, which was their life on earth, into their afterlife. And this is what you see in the tombs in Europe and everything, and this is what you see by people depicting little simple things on stones here in America. They just wanted to, if somebody found it or looked at it, they wanted to be remembered. This is what we did, and this is who we were.
So this is the photo album by the pictures and the murals that and the mosaics and everything else, as well as a diary where they had written tablets. So that's
right.
That's what we're seeing, not only in the ancient ones that are found all around the Mediterranean and elsewhere in the world.
These were the rich people in the Mediterranean world who could afford nice, beautiful murals inside their tombs and all that. But now we're seeing just common people. All they could do is carve something on stone and say, "Here, this is what I like. I like this type of a woman," or, I like they're doing this, or I like to plow the fields, or here's a beautiful portrait. This is what I looked like, or this is what my wife looked like, and they wanted to be remembered in that way. And it's just fascinating. These people live to live. They enjoyed this life here. This is what they wanted to do.
So what we're going to see with these new pictures that Harry has just gotten of artifacts that somebody else was holding that came out of the Illinois caves, we're going to see more detail of exactly what you're talking about, kind of like the personal diaries.
Yes. Yeah.
That's going to be fun. There was something that we had spoken about privately that I wanted you to mention on the show here, and that was about the history behind Alexander the Great's helmet. And there is that one artifact that's sitting on IllinoisCaves.com, that one picture where it shows Alexander the Great. In fact, it says it's him. I think I'm right. It says, you deciphered and found out that it says it was Alexander the Great, and it has a picture and a certain type of helmet. And explain that. Now, does that agree with anywhere else in the world that had these glyphs or any type of carved rock pictures or anything, or mosaics or whatever? Does what came out of Illinois Caves agree with what has been found previously in the world?
Well, what's very interesting about that particular little portrait, it shows, it gives Alexander's name. It shows him wearing this breastplate with a bird on it. And this bird also symbolizes Alexander in his name, because the Greek version of Alexander is like a savior of mankind, is the actual literal meaning of his name.
Wow.
A savior of man. And the bird associated with his name kind of represents the famous demigod Prometheus. He was like one of the gods that loved mankind so much that he gave fire to man. Well, the gods were very upset at Prometheus that he was chained to a mountain, and for eternity an eagle would be pecking out his liver daily.
Oh, wonderful.
So Prometheus was associated as like he loved man, savior of man, and the name Alexander is what that means, that he is the savior of mankind.
Wow.
And that's
knew that.
That's the bird on the breastplate that represents, it has that it goes back to Prometheus and all this, and what he did for man, and Alexander did the same thing. That's on his breastplate. Now you see his helmet. His helmet is very much different than what you would see, the typical Greek Corinthian helmet, as they called it. This thing looks more like something from the Middle East, or as you would see the Philistines. The Philistine people, that lived along the coast were near Israel. It's a type of helmet that you would have seen them have it, or the sea peoples from around 1200 BC, from the time of Troy, the Trojan War. This was the type of helmet that the Minoan kings wore at that time, from Crete and from mainland Greece, the Mycenaean age.
Now that looks different
than... Why would Alexander be wearing a Mycenaean-type helmet? Well, it said that when he crossed into Asia, that him and Hephaestion, his best friend, visited the tomb of Achilles to give tribute to the hero who had fallen in the Trojan War. And at that tomb, he took the helmet of Achilles, and he took his sword and breastplate. And he figured that with that armor that he could conquer the world. So what you see on this artifact is that Alexander is depicted wearing the helmet of Achilles, which dates back to an era almost 900 years before Alexander's time.
Wow.
So this is why the helmet is so different from what you would see of the Corinthian style, the typical Greek helmets. Now, Hollywood in the Alexander movies have him wearing a typical Corinthian helmet with the plumes and all that. And it is a very short helmet also. Now, when Alexander fought his first battle against the Persians on the Granicus River, this is shortly after he visited Troy and got the armor. The Persian satraps, the two armies lined up against the river. On one side, you had the Macedonian with the phalanx and Alexander with his companion cavalry, a lot of men. On the other side, you had Persian cavalry lined up, daring him to cross. And they were going to shower the whole army with missiles as they were crossing. Well, Alexander, as brave as he always was, he decided to charge right across the river and go right into the Persians. And instantaneously, the Persian commanders there knew exactly who he was because they could pick him out. Well, if he was wearing a traditional Corinthian helmet, it would be very difficult to tell him from all the other Macedonian horsemen that were in his group. However, if he was wearing that special helmet of Achilles, that tall helmet with the plumes sticking out, the Persian commanders would detect him quite easily from a distance. And as they did, they charged for him, and the goal was to kill Alexander. One of them actually managed to cut the helmet in half. This is what the Greek historian said. He swung once with his sword axe and cut the helmet right in half, and it just got a few hairs off the top of Alexander's head, but it cut the helmet right in half across. And then when he was ready to strike a second time, one of Alexander's companions was able to save his life and kill the Persian commander. Now, if Alexander was wearing a traditional Corinthian helmet which stuck to the head, any blow to it would have been fatal to him. But he had to have been wearing a tall helmet, as depicted on that artifact from the cave, that the Persian was able to cut the top half off without actually hurting Alexander's head.
Makes sense.
And that is the first battle of the Granicus. Now, you will see Alexander fight a battle after that with the Persian Emperor Darius, King Darius, and you clearly see a famous picture that you can look up on the internet that was discovered in the city of Pompeii that was buried by Mount Vesuvius, 79 A.D. They uncovered from one of the wealthy homes a beautiful painting, and it is known as the Alexander Mosaic. Well, in the Alexander Mosaic, you see Alexander charging King Darius. But there's something very peculiar. All the men around, the Persians are wearing their regular tiaras. You could see in the background some of the Macedonian cavalrymen. They're wearing typical Macedonian helmets. However, Alexander is not wearing a helmet at all. You can just see him with no helmet, just charging into the Persian ranks. Well, it could be a possibility that because the helmet of Achilles got destroyed in the first battle and he survived it, that Alexander may have been so cocky at that point that he believed he needed no helmet. And very possibly that mosaic is also an accurate depiction of Alexander's battles thereafter, where he just didn't care at that point.
Wow.
That's one thing that I picked out very interesting from.
Well, what we do see, though, is in that particular one that you do have on IllinoisCaves.com, that picture of Alexander. It says it's Alexander the Great, and it shows the Achilles helmet that you were describing. So that shows pretty darn authentic, and here it is in Illinois, and it's showing something that should have been found perhaps in Persia or Greek or somewhere along the Mediterranean. That's where we've got to understand that Illinois Caves is that's an authentic cave. These things, had they been modern forgeries, common sense would tell me then we'd probably see more of like a Roman type helmet or the tighter helmet that you were just talking about.
The one that Richard Burton wore in that 50s movie of Alexander.
Okay. Yeah, a Hollywood helmet. There we go.
The typical Hollywood type helmet, yes. But he's wearing one. Alexander is wearing a helmet from the Mycenaean period, which dates around 1200 BC. The Greeks, the King Agamemnon, Achilles, during the Trojan War when they went to get Helen of Troy. That's the kind of helmets that they wore in the old days. And even the later Greek tombs like to show these heroes. This is another thing. I don't even think a lot of the Greeks or the Romans even had a clue what type of helmet was worn at that time. Because in some of the tombs, they would depict the heroes wearing Corinthian-type helmets. But then when Alexander went to the tomb of Achilles and picked the helmet out, here you have this tall thing. So number one, it had to have been an eyewitness that this is what was left over from 800 years ago. Somebody must have recorded what that helmet looked like to get passed on from generation down, that this is the one that Alexander wore prior to the Battle of Granicus. But evidence shows that he didn't wear any more helmets after that. There's even a hunting scene. There's even a hunting scene of Alexander in Afghanistan in one of the tombs in Macedonia that shows him hunting with some Persians, satraps, and he's not wearing a helmet either at that point. So I could guess that Alexander just didn't, after he lost that Achilles helmet, he probably said, that's it, I don't need one, I'm a god.
Well, that's why he ended up with the name Alexander the Great, no doubt. if he's going into battles without a helmet,
well, he always
that would either be insane or brave. He'd either be insane or extremely brave, or think that he really was a god and there is no way that anybody could kill him.
And he also led from the front. Number one, he had to see the entire battlefield and then give orders and commands. And he was an active participant in the battle, too. And he had to time everything perfectly for his victories. It's some of the best timing ever. And probably a helmet would have hindered him, so he had to have a full view of action constantly. So this is probably why later on he decided not to wear a helmet, because he was always in the thick of things.
Wow. Remarkable man, or as others have said, he's one of the gods. So you mentioned, I've got a question. You mentioned about his breastplate, which we see in that picture that's on the site. The bird that's on there, is that a phoenix? What kind of bird is that? An eagle, phoenix?
It's an eagle. That's really, I don't think it's anything more than it's probably just an eagle.
Huh. I noticed that in some of the other artifacts there are pictures of birds. Are some of those possibly from what was brought over prior to the Illinois caves being built, or perhaps are some of them showing birds that were indigenous here with North America, or both? Have you got any idea about that? Especially with the animals. I know that we talked about. I spoke with Harry when he was on about horses, and some were definitely, without a doubt, those were the warrior horses around the Mediterranean. Some were the southern Mediterranean, more desert war horses, and then you had the northern ones that were stockier, different necks, and they were adorned differently, which was a combination more of the northern war horse from Europe. What's in the caves that we've pulled out? Do you think there's a mixture of the older war horses that had to do with Alexander the Great? Then do we see any depictions of anything that might be indigenous for North America to give us more of a history that for sure they were there and this is not a mistake?
I don't know. The only thing I see that these people have apparently had a fascination with whales.
And the dolphins too. I think there was a dolphin. And the dolphins.
They obviously had a fascination with those animals.
Well, I'll tell you
I don't know.
What that signifies to me, and I'm sorry I interrupted you because I think this is important. It signifies to me that there really was a trade route going down the Mississippi through the Gulf and heading back to the Mediterranean, because the dolphins and the whales were something that really is mainly indigenous to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. There weren't pictures or remnants or artifacts or anything of too many dolphins anywhere else in the world that I know of. If I'm wrong, correct me, but I just think that proves that this was a well-established trading route. And I think you had mentioned the last show that it was possibly because of all the copper mining that was done along the Mississippi. Everywhere along the Mississippi were copper mines and still are some. I think Kennecott had a lot of mines. But anyway, okay, let's talk about ships. There's a lot of those tablets and artifacts, the stone carvings that came out of the Illinois caves so far that we've got up there on the site. And apparently there's more to add coming. But I know about building boats. And one thing I don't know that you can give me a history lesson on is the different shapes and types of boats. So go through some of the things that were taken out of Illinois caves with the boats. It was apparently one of the most common themes was to show the pictures of the boats with other activities going around. So let's get into the boats, the ships. Some are older, obviously, than others. So explain what so far that you've got pictures of. Explain the different styles and where they might have come from.
Okay. The boats they would have used for transport is, first of all, they would have had to load a lot of things from their home, and they would have had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So they had to have ocean-going vessels. to do that. And archaeologists have found from Cleopatra's time, under the Alexandria harbor, they found this gigantic, massive ship from the time period of Cleopatra. It was a merchant ship. And that thing could have crossed oceans quite easily. Everybody's heard about the Phoenicians, but then as Roman times came along, they used to say, well, the Greeks and the Romans basically had the trireme and the quinquereme, the 3-decker and the 5-decker warships. These were really designed only for warfare, and they were very prevalent in the Mediterranean. Even throughout the Roman imperial days, they really never had a constant standing navy. They just had a few squadrons of small ships, basically to deal with pirates. But what everybody had was a merchant fleet. Those were the giant ocean, deep sea-going vessels that would carry goods from point A to point B. And the Phoenicians started that a long time ago, like going back as far as 1000 B.C. The Phoenicians were very famous for building ships to carry products from one point to another across the Mediterranean. They even went past the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. Got out in the Atlantic and traded tin with Great Britain, England, and Ireland. So they had ocean-going ships. The Celtic people also had ocean-going ships. Now, as you get into the Greek times, the Greeks basically built warships. They had smaller trade ships, but not anything like the Phoenicians had. And then afterwards, the Phoenicians built the port of Carthage. And Carthage was another merchant city in North Africa, and they had a merchant fleet. So basically all the Phoenicians cared about was building merchant fleets, which were ocean-going vessels, and all they cared about was making money. Now, you start seeing in Greek history, when the Greeks came into conflict with the Persian Empire, they had like these small trireme warships, which were very fast and designed for ramming, but they were not meant for crossing oceans. So when the Persians in 490, when Xerxes decided to invade Greece, he requisitioned the Phoenician navy from the coast of Lebanon, and they had a huge fleet, but he requisitioned them for supplies and to use their ships to fight the Greek navy, primarily the Athenians. However, there was one problem. The Phoenician fleet was really a merchant fleet. They were not built for war. They were large, cumbersome ships designed to carry supplies. So when Xerxes got that navy going to attack the Greeks knew exactly that ship on ship they could annihilate the Phoenician ships. The only thing is they couldn't be out at open sea where numbers could tell. So when the entire Phoenician ship, which outnumbered the Greek fleet like 8-1, it was huge, but they were not warships. That's what a lot of people don't realize. They somehow say it was a giant fleet, but they were not warships. They were merchant ships converted into war. The Athenians built these small triremes very quickly, and they were just designed to fight the war. So what they did is they chased the Persians into a small area around Salamis Bay where they could fight the Persian ships one-on-one, and all they did is just ram and sink, because these were very slow ships, and the Greeks were able to annihilate the entire Persian fleet, which was Phoenician merchantmen, quite easily. Well, then later on, you had another incident happen when Romans went to war with the Carthaginians. The First Punic War especially was a naval war. Well, Rome was never a naval power. They were a land power. The Carthaginians were a naval power, but they were a merchant fleet once again. All they cared about was making money. So when they went to war with Rome, they just refitted their merchant ships for war. What did the Romans do? They never had a fleet. They got a bunch of Greek shipbuilders together and said, hey, build us a couple thousand triremes. So what they did is they entirely deforested the island of Sicily, which at one time was beautiful green with forests. The Romans completely deforested that to make a makeshift fleet, a very quick makeshift fleet, just for war. And they had very good boarding tactics, and they defeated the Carthaginian fleets decisively. The Carthaginian fleet was no match for the Roman fleet at all, because the Romans built these special ships just for war only. And this is what happened, and even it goes into Cleopatra's time. Her fleet was a giant merchant fleet designed for trade. And once again, when they did battle with the Romans, they just built ships just quickly for war, which were fast little torpedoes that could ram these giant ships, and they could board their Marines on them. And this is what actually came over here. They got a bunch of these giant merchant ships together, and this is what they sailed across the Atlantic with. And this is actually what you see as a big depiction of kind of wide ships and kind of wide and chesty instead of long and slinky like the warships were.
Mm-hmm.
So basically you have it from the Phoenicians all the way down to Cleopatra's Egypt, that their ship was a merchant fleet, and yes, they did traverse across the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean. They traded with India, and they also traded along the coast of Africa, and quite easily could have also designated a fleet for transporting copper from North America across to Europe.
Yeah, that's my guess. Not just with the copper. So many different resources that are in North America and easily accessible. So many are so near, just not just copper mines, but other ore, even iron and such, is so accessible to the Mississippi River. It had to be a major trade route. And, of course, you keep mentioning, well, they had these big merchant ships because they were doing it for the money. Well, that's what a merchant does. That's why you build big ships. And it makes sense to put all your resources into big freighters, so to speak, and discover different resources around the world and bring in it was so important to the Egyptians about dye, especially the purple dye that came from China. So obviously, that makes a lot of sense that especially Egypt with their fleet was probably the at the time of Alexander the Great was the center of world trade. Just call it the World Trade Center.
Right. After Alexander, during the Ptolemaic era, they were the center of world trade. And in the older days, everybody hired the Phoenicians to do their, they had the merchant fleet, so everybody hired them. And after Alexander, his successor states, Alexandria was a giant port, and they had the merchant fleet there too. Exactly.
Wow. So here we've got these depictions that were carved in the stone, found in Illinois caves.
Yeah, and when you see like the Roman warships in the movie and all that, this was not a permanent standing navy. These ships were built very quickly to fight a very quick battle, and they were just as quickly dismantled after that.
Kind of like PT boats going after freighters.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's exactly what they were. They built, even when Caesar was invading Gaul, when he was attacking Gaul, he ran across a group of seafaring Gauls called the Veneti off the southern, it's off what today would be off the coast of Bordeaux, around the Bordeaux region of France, and off the coast there, the southwestern coast of France. This is where the Veneti lived. And they felt invincible because they had an island area, and the Romans couldn't get to them because the Veneti had these beautiful ocean-going ships. So what did Caesar do? He did basically the same as the Romans did before. These big ships were merchant ships once again. So what Caesar did is he cut down an entire forest, built these small triremes. The wood wasn't even seasoned. It didn't matter. He just built it in a matter of days. It was just enough to get soldiers across and start ramming these big, slow ships. And that's exactly what happened. Is these small Roman ships were so much faster that they could grapple these slow big ships, and they could land their soldiers on them and just kill everybody on board or set them on fire. And these big Gallic ships could not move because they were giant merchant tubs. And once the battle was over, those Roman ships were completely dismantled, and the wood was used for something else or whatever, it just burnt. But this is the Romans never really maintained a navy. It was just always makeshift for whatever the situation required. The only shipping you had were the merchant ships, and that was it, the continuous shipping.
So with all the artifacts so far, and again, I want to bring up the point, there's a lot of new ones that pictures are about to be within the next couple of weeks, I hope, will end up on IllinoisCaves.com. And some new decipherments from you, so you're going to be busy. These ships and the artifacts that have actually come out of Illinois Caves so far, the ones that we do have up there on your site, what are they showing? Mostly the merchant ships, or are there some? Are there some?
They're all merchant.
Oh, they're all okay.
They're all merchant ships, and the only other thing they show is sometimes like a river reed boat that would go up a river. That's about it. But anything crossing the sea, it's all a big merchant type of a ship. They're they're no warships at all.
Well, if they were in North America, sitting close to the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and such, and we're doing trading, there wouldn't be any need for a warship, would there?
No.
Wouldn't be necessary. So there was nothing to conquer since they already were there in the land. It must have made treaties or whatever with the local inhabitants, the indigenous people that would have been in North America at the time, if there were any. Who knows?
And a very strange thing about, there had to have been a trade going through the Gulf of Mexico, because the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians would always like to keep those things a secret. And they would tell a story that if you sailed across the Pillars of Hercules and you sailed far west of Libya, you will hit some water where you will see some kind of oily brown streaks and sea monsters and all that. Just to try to discourage people, from going.
Oh, so they were putting up the sea monster deal.
Well, I don't know about the sea monster, but they're talking about brown lines in the water that are oily, and this is like what they tell them. This is like what sea monsters left. This is like what the sea monsters kind of, when they shed their skin or something like that, shows that there's a bunch of sea monsters there. I'm just curious, as much oil as there is in the Gulf of Mexico, one earthquake or something like that and some little oil, floating at the top would give the illusion of it being a sea monster or something. Who knows?
Well,
that would have had to happen in the Gulf of Mexico.
But that would make sense in the Gulf of Mexico because we have those salt domes with asphaltic tar under them, and that's been there for thousands and thousands of years. So it's nothing new that the Gulf of Mexico has been seeping oil since history has ever been recorded.
And this one account from Diodorus is using what the Carthaginians would use as propaganda to stay away. It almost is like they're describing, well, if you head towards that area, you're going to run into this oily water, and there's going to be a lot of sea monsters there. So there may have been some truth to it.
May have been
some type of an oil spill or something, from an earthquake or tar seepage or something like that. That there was evidence that they were actually in the Gulf of Mexico a long time ago and recorded such an event.
Well, with the whales that are depicted on some of these things out of the Illinois Caves, do you think that was depicting whales in Europe? Or do you think that they were depicting the whales in their journeys as merchants coming down the Mississippi and going back to the Mediterranean? What do you think?
Probably what they encountered along the way.
Well, that would make sense too. Yeah. Well, then we've also got
probably more here. because they're depicted on the artifacts over here, and it's something that they really thought would be very important.
Yeah. Then, of course, we've got possibly out in the middle of the Atlantic, the old island Atlantis. Perhaps that could have been a mecca for whales and dolphins. It might have been very much like the Caribbean is now before everything sunk down to deep depths. Who knows? You know, that's the great thing of trying to piece it all together, huh? You know, with what's been shown in the caves so far, it really depicts actual, honest-to-goodness life. Not only what's just written, but also the pictures that were carved into these stones. It's depicting two things. It's showing the ancient history, their history brought over from the Mediterranean, going back hundreds and perhaps thousands of years, and it's also depicting their life in North America in what we call Illinois now. To me, that shows real authenticity, because apparently we found with the Illinois caves pretty much of a historical library of before their time. Yeah. And that was probably, what, about 2,000 years ago, you think, when, you know, what's the timeline with this? When do you think they established the Illinois caves? Is there anything that gives an idea of that?
Obviously, there was activity here with the copper trade a long time before these people came. These people what they did is, after Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide and Egypt was completely engulfed by the Roman Empire and was annexed, what happened is a lot of disgruntled people decided to gather their national treasures and whatever and get out. Obviously, they knew through the copper trade that there was a place here to go to. It wasn't just jumping in on a ship and hopefully finding a place where they could live. They knew exactly where they were going, out of reach, but it was already established and known about. And the time period I have is shortly after probably 29 BC as of one point. I believe Queen Cleopatra actually took the bodies of Alexander the Great, which were at that time in Alexandria in this mausoleum called the Sema. I believe what she did is she took him and hid him somewhere in a very important sanctuary, which was known as Tapaziris Major, which is 50 kilometers to the west of Alexandria. It was a sacred Egyptian precinct, and these sacred precincts were kind of like independent countries that had their own ambassadors, and they had diplomatic immunity. It was like the famous Artemisium in Ephesus in Turkey, what is today Turkey. It was the famous Artemisium, was a sacred ground. Now, a situation that happened during the time of Cleopatra and Mark Antony was Cleopatra's little sister, Arsinoe, was given sanctuary at the Artemisium, but Cleopatra wanted her dead, and Mark Antony was in charge of that area. He sent some guards, completely breaking diplomatic protocol. He sent some guards in there and had the poor girl assassinated. And it was really a big blow to the Roman Empire, to all the Romans. They considered that a hideous act of breaking the diplomatic immunity of a sanctum like that. So understanding the mentality of the Romans, what I believe Cleopatra did is before they entered Alexandria, she took the corpse of Alexander the Great and all the treasures and everybody and moved them to a place called Tapaziris, which was 50 kilometers west of Alexandria, right on the coast. And they would be protected there. And, of course, Augustus would not break this diplomatic protocol at all because he accused Mark Antony of doing it. So to look good, he would have, even if he had an inkling that those treasures were there, he would not have dared to break that diplomatic immunity. So then at a later date, the time there came a time in 9 A.D. when there was a big panic throughout the Roman Empire, is when 3 legions were annihilated in Germany under Varus. And 3 legions out of 29, that's a good percentage of Roman army, just disappeared in a period of 3 days. And that brought such shockwaves into the Roman Empire that they had to send recruits, soldiers that were stationed in Egypt, North Africa, and everywhere immediately had to be moved up to the German front because they believed that the Germanic tribes were going to come down and plunder Rome.
Mm-hmm.
So that would have been a perfect opportunity at that time for those bodies to be loaded from Tapaziris onto the big ships, and then they could have sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean without anybody really even bothering or knowing what happened because of the Great Panic. So I think the bodies and the treasure were transported over here probably around 9 A.D., but Alexander, Helios, and Yuba were already well established over here. That's just one theory that I have. Now, the reason I chose Tapaziris Minor is because a Dominican archaeologist by the name of Kathleen Martinez recently has done some excavations. They're believing she could find the tomb of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. However, what they did is they found these little marble heads, one of them of Ptolemy, another one of Alexander the Great, and another one of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, but they have not found any corpses there. And to me, what these little marble heads were like markers that possibly it was an area that at one time the bodies and the mummies could have been stored, but have been moved since. And all you have is some remnant effigies, which is what she found. But they have not found anything, and they're not going to find anything.
Now, where did she find these marble heads and such? Where is this?
There were little marble heads of all these famous characters at Tapaziris, which was very interesting because it had Cleopatra, it had Ptolemy I, it had Alexander the Great, which kind of says that at one point their sarcophagi and their corpses were stored in that area, possibly. But she's still looking for it. She hasn't found it and will not find anything there.
But here in Illinois Caves, we've got these tablets that are coming right out with the name Alexander the Great, Alexander Helios. Who else is entombed in Illinois according to what the carvings are saying?
Queen Cleopatra and Mark Antony were brought over here too at a later date, as well as Alexander the Great and possibly Ptolemy I, Alexander's half-brother, who was a general, is also in there. He founded the dynasty. He was brought over here too. So possibly the entire Ptolemaic crypt was brought over here.
Wow.
And the thing is, up till like 1990, everybody was looking for Alexander the Great's body in Alexandria. But they pretty much dug up everything in Alexandria. And then they said, well, maybe the earthquake sunk it. It's under sunken water and everything. Who knows? But there is a scholar from Greece. There's another British scholar. And then there's Kathleen Martinez. This is a new school of scholars believe that at one point Alexander's body may have been moved from Alexandria. One of the Greeks theorizes that it was taken back to Macedonia. An Englishman believes that the so-called tomb of St. Mark's in Venice, the bones of the so-called St. Mark's, is actually Alexander the Great's bones. But, of course, the Vatican will not let him do a forensic test or anything to prove his theory. But, once again, it's talk that Alexander's body has been moved. And, of course, Kathleen Martinez believes that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried out in Tapaziris. But yet we find a little Alexander head out there, too. So it's quite possible that all of them were put there for a period of time. But it's generally more in the direction that Alexander's body was moved at one point out of Alexandria. And then we had Dr. Tsavalkis back in 92, a woman and her husband, archaeologist, who thought he was buried out in Sibel in Egypt. And she got her information from talking to snakes, so she didn't have that much credibility. But the general norm has been lately in the past 20 years is, well, maybe Alexander's body possibly was moved at one point. Of course, we knew it. We knew it was moved over here.
Yeah. Well, according to what these tablets and everything are saying, coming out of southern Illinois, gee, it's no wonder they call it Little Egypt. I mean, you know, some
Alexander's
obvious.
Alexander's body was a national treasure. And it was like his General Ptolemy hijacked it. They figured whoever owns Alexander's body was going to rule the world or going to have the prestige. So when the Romans finally finished the Ptolemaic dynasty and Cleopatra, Mark Antony committed suicide, the survivors, they weren't, and that's another thing, had Augustus really saw the tomb of Alexander the Great and all these Roman emperors, as Roman history records, yes, he entered the tomb of Alexander and all that, well, possibly have entered the location that once was the tomb of Alexander, but actually viewing the corpse, there's no record of it. And as vain as the Romans were, if Augustus has actually found the sarcophagus of Alexander, he would have taken that thing back to Rome and left it in his palace. He wouldn't have left it in Egypt.
Yeah, big trophy.
Yeah, you're going to take the big trophy with you to Rome. Hey, I got Alexander's body. I want that thing to be near me. I want his magic to inspire me. You would take that treasure, that sarcophagus, and put it in Rome into your mausoleum there. It's mine now.
That's
like
an
Alexander's
excellent point.
Alexander's general, they didn't bury him in Macedonia. We wanted to. Ptolemy took him to Egypt, to his kingdom. Well, the Romans, had they found him there, they would have taken him back to Rome, just like all these other treasures. You know, that when they looted the temple in Jerusalem, they took all those treasures back to Rome. Well, Alexander's corpse was a huge national treasure. That would have ended up in Rome, too, but it didn't, which tells me that they knew that it was no longer there, so they probably just wrote some propaganda to please the public. Oh, yeah, well, we're going to keep it in Egypt or whatever.
Well, apparently it was in Illinois, or at least on the way. You know, this just makes a lot of common sense to me. And really, that's a good point about had the ruler of the Roman Empire at the time, had Alexander the Great's body really been in the tomb in Alexandria, for sure, he would have had that with a special, you know, temple and mausoleum built around it, and like you said, real close to him, because Alexander the Great was considered a god, you know, the conqueror of the known world. So that would have given him such political power, at the very least, to have that sarcophagus sitting in Rome, but it's not.
Or if he was really, really, you know, pro-Greek and generous and all this, well, I think Alexander should be buried back in Macedonia. More likely, with a Roman ego, would have been putting him in Rome next to your palace where you could have him as a trophy. But had he been more of a humanitarian and with respect, it would have been, well, we're going to move him back to Macedonia where he can be buried in his homeland where he was born and be with the other Macedonian kings. But that didn't happen either. That would have been recorded all over the place. It didn't happen. It was just ignored and, oh, well, we're leaving it in Egypt. Well, why?
Wow. You know, this is like a gigantic puzzle of pieces all over the world and trying to make one piece fit.
Exactly, and Alexander's corpse was a national treasure.
Still is. And it just apparently is sitting in southern Illinois. Well, that's what we hope someday, between especially with yours and Harry Hubbard's efforts and all the pieces that you put together and what you have personally deciphered that others just couldn't seem to get, and in your videos, I want to make a point of letting the audience know. Go to IllinoisCaves.com. Go look at some of these videos that were done in 1995, 1997, where Paul breaks it down. I mean, it couldn't be plainer for anybody to understand than what you did in those videos. It's just Amazing. I mean, it's simple. That's why I'm stumbling here. You made it look simple, and when you follow in the videos of how you broke it down, it really is simple.
And the whole thing with Alexander, it's amazing how many miles he traveled. In life, he traveled all the way from Greece to Afghanistan. He died in Babylon. Then at death, his body was moved from Babylon, intended for Greece. It was hijacked and taken to Egypt. It stayed in Egypt for 300 years. Then after 300 years, it was boarded on board of a ship and taken across the Atlantic Ocean and ended up in Illinois. I think he traveled a lot more miles dead than he did when he was alive.
Well, he really had a good afterlife, I guess, where he was seeing the world kind of like on a cruise ship. I want to ask, we're getting close to the end here. I want to ask real quick, explain, you've got the name of the company that you and Harry came up with, Alexander Helios. Why is that so important with these tombs in southern Illinois, and who is Alexander Helios? Is he part of the family of Alexander the Great?
Well, Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra VII, was a descendant of Ptolemy I, who was a half-brother of Alexander. Ptolemy I was one of Alexander's generals. After Alexander died, he became Pharaoh of Egypt. He carved that kingdom out for himself and became Pharaoh of Egypt. 300 years later, Cleopatra, she was the last queen of Egypt. Alexander Helios is a son of Queen Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And he was the one that ended up escaping and taking the corpses over here with the help of his brother-in-law, King Yuba, whom his sister Cleopatra Selene was married to. And Alexander Helios is the son of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So some way, yes, he is a much further descendant of Alexander the Great, but he is also a continuation of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Wow. And he is the one that plays a pivotal part here in North America.
Yeah, I've noticed that his cartouche, you found lots of them were taken out of the tomb in southern Illinois. So obviously,
and he disappears from history at age 8. About 8 or 10 years old, you don't hear anything about him anymore. And then all of a sudden here, we're finding artifacts of an adult, and his name is Alexander Helios, related to Queen Cleopatra. And then we see the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great. It's like, wait a minute. Wait, something happened here that's not in the history books.
Well, Paul, we're down to seconds here, so I just want to say thank you again for being on, and I can't wait for the next show. We'll be part 11 soon, and with some new information between you and Harry. Can't wait. Thanks again, Paul. It's man, I got a great history lesson today, so thanks
great.
again. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, so that's it, and join us another week from now, part 11. I don't know if we're going to have Paul and Harry on, one or the other, or both. I want to get both of them on here soon. So there's a lot of new things coming up, and hang in there. Stay tuned, as they say, because apparently we ain't seen nothing yet when it comes to what's been taken out of the Illinois caves. Reminder, IllinoisCaves.com. Look at the pictures. See the videos. Get an education. And in signing off here for this particular segment of the series, just remember, be who you were created to be.
Inform, enlighten, alive and amplify. This is the Living Light Network.
or I like to plow the fields, or here's a beautiful portrait, this is what I looked like, or this is what my wife looked like. And they want it to be remembered in that way. And it's just fascinating. These people live to live. You know, they enjoyed this life here. This is what they wanted to do.
So what we're going to see with these new pictures that Harry has just gotten of artifacts that somebody else was holding that came out of the Illinois caves, we're going to see more detail of exactly what you're talking about, kind of like the personal diaries.
Yes. Yeah,
that's going to be fun. You know, there was something that we had spoken about privately that I wanted you to mention on the show here, and that was about the history behind Alexander the Great's helmet. And there is that one artifact that's sitting on IllinoisCaves.com, that one picture where it shows Alexander the Great. In fact, it says it's him. I think I'm right. It says, you deciphered and found out that it says it was Alexander the Great, and it has a picture and a certain type of helmet. And explain that. Now, does that agree with anywhere else in the world that had these glyphs or any type of carved rock pictures or anything, or mosaics or whatever? Does what came out of Illinois Caves agree with what has been found previously in the world?
Well, what's very interesting about that particular little portrait, it gives Alexander's name. It shows him wearing this breastplate with a bird on it. And this bird also symbolizes Alexander in his name, because the Greek version of Alexander is like a savior of mankind, is the actual literal meaning of his name.
Wow.
A savior of man. And the bird associated with his name.
Caves.com. Be lots of new additions on there, and I'm sure that Paul will be busy with new decipherments. So, Paul, thanks again for joining me on here. I apologize last week. I had some problems and we couldn't do the show, but here we are. So, good morning, Paul.
Good morning. How are you?
Great.
You would have no idea. The amount of information that has just come in to me the past 3 days and photographs of new artifacts is just unbelievable.
I don't doubt it. I got a preview. I got a small preview. Somebody who was with Harry took a few pictures. They weren't really good quality, but wow. It just looks like the continuation of all the pictures on your site with new things on there. So what grabbed you? You've gotten a sneak peek probably more than I have. What did you see on there that really grabbed your attention of these new pictures of artifacts that came out of there?
Everyday life of these people.
Uh-huh.
Even just their religious beliefs and just the things they did, and it'd be very interesting. Some of these tablets are like large with a lot of script on there, and I'm going to be very curious what I'm going to be able to come up with on the script.
Sounds like you're going to be
a lot of them are
busy.
portraits. A lot of them are scripted. Some are pornographic, which is expected from that era. Unbelievable stuff. It is just absolutely unbelievable what some of the things, just the depictions and all that. It's just artwork by common lay people at that time.
You sound like a kid who just found out it was Christmas morning.
This is exactly how I feel. Is like, wow.
Welcome once again, White Owl Reports, Michael Edward. Today, nice Sunday morning, we're doing part 10 of a series that we've been doing about IllinoisCaves.com, the lost tomb of Alexander the Great. And today we're going to speak with Paul Schaffranke, who, if you've listened to the last episode, part 9, it was the first time that Paul was on with us. Paul is the one who broke the code, so to speak, of these different tablets and the writings that were on them, and was able to realize how to make something out of what was really an ancient Etruscan language that was written on there, among others. Paul doesn't like to be called a linguist. He's not just a linguist, because that would be an academic think only within a box, which is true. But Paul just used a lot of common sense and has a great knowledge of ancient languages, especially with Latin, which, as we discussed on the last show, was not really a spoken language. It was a government language. It was an official language for records. So Paul is, again, somebody who broke the code and is able to make sense with a lot of these writings, these tablets that came out of the Illinois caves. And I might add in there that his partner and associate from the beginning with all this, Harry Hubbard, has been able to get some fantastic pictures of additional artifacts that came out of the caves that they have never seen or dealt with before. So we're about ready to break open some new things here. So obviously this series is going to continue. As soon as we get those pictures and such, it'll be on their site, Illinois.
There's a lot more. It's just more pieces of the puzzle we're going to be able to put together. And hopefully, I mean, we pretty much have a story of a very general background story of what happened and how people got over here. But now we're going to be seeing what happened while they were over here, and just everyday life things, just things that they inscribed on rock that they wanted somebody to remember.
Wow. So now you're going to get more details.
Now we're going to get more details.
Great. Well, like I said, either like a kid that realizes it's Christmas morning, or you got in a candy store and you haven't had candy for 10 years.
It is, and another thing I noticed just by looking at a lot of these artifacts is these were just common people that just inscribed things in their basic language. They're pretty good artists, some of them, but they really wanted to leave something to show, so if somebody picked it up, they knew what they were doing in a daily life. They wanted to be remembered.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one thing about the ancient cultures. When you look at ancient Egypt, for example, let's not just think of the pharaohs and the kings and their fancy tombs. You look at tombs of just regular middle-class people that were property owners. You know, they always had tombs built for themselves. You go to the Etruscan tombs. You go to Greek tombs. The Etruscan tombs, the Greek tombs, the Egyptian tombs, all these had beautiful artwork inside. And it was generally from day-to-day living. So, for example, in Egypt, there was a tomb they found of a farmer. He owned quite a bit of property, and on his tomb walls, he had painted everyday conversations he had with his workers, the gossip, and just simple things like that. This is what they wanted to take to the afterlife, and this is what they wanted people to remember him by. And you see the same thing in Etruscan tombs. If their favorite was literature and Greeks, you would show them hunting, going out horseback riding, or just looking over their vineyards. They would depict things that they enjoyed during life. And the same thing you see in the tombs of the Macedonian kings in northern Greece. You go inside and you see this beautiful mural of hunting. Alexander's stepbrother hunting boar and lions. This is just a depiction of horseback riding, hunting. So whatever they believed in the afterlife, which we know they did, they wanted to take the memories of their life. They enjoyed life so much that they wanted to depict it either on stone or murals, or they believed that their soul went on to the afterlife. They wanted to take these memories from this life to the next world. Unlike a lot of people today, they want to die because they don't want to have anything to do with this live world. There's a lot of pessimism today. People just, I don't want to remember anything. I just want to die and go on to heaven, to a better place. Well, the ancient people, they wanted to take the better place, which was their life on earth, into their afterlife. And This is what you see in the tombs in Europe and everything, and this is what you see by people depicting little simple things on stones here in America. They just wanted to, if somebody found it or looked at it, they wanted to be remembered. This is what we did, and this is who we were.
So this is the photo album by the pictures and the murals that and the mosaics and everything else, as well as a diary where they had written tablets. So that's
right.
That's what we're seeing, not only in the ancient ones that are found all around the Mediterranean and elsewhere in the world.
These were the rich people in the Mediterranean world who could afford nice, beautiful murals inside their tombs and all that. But now we're seeing this common people. All they could do is carve something on stone and say, "Here, this is what I liked. I like this type of a woman," or, "I like they're doing this."